Welcome to the History of Science Society's Centennial Podcast, a podcast to celebrate the fact that the HSS is soon to turn 100. This is produced in collaboration with the Consortium for the History of Science, Technology, and Medicine. I'm Matt Shindell. I'm the Secretary of the History of Science Society, and I'm going to be hosting today's episode, History of Science at the Movies. So we're now in the dog days of summer. Here in the Washington, D.C. area where I'm recording, we're supposed to hit 98 degrees Fahrenheit today. It's the perfect weather to retreat into an air-conditioned theater to see a movie. So go get your popcorn because, as everyone knows, there's a new History of Science biopic conquering the box office as we speak, Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer. So we've decided to use this as an occasion to convene a film forum to discuss Barbie's physicist counterpart, along with 3 other films. There are 4 of us here today. I'm joined by Yangyang Cheng, David Hecht, and Amit Prasad. We all watched the 4 films that we're going to discuss today, and each of us has written a review of one of the films that will appear in the HSS newsletter. To kick things off, I want to turn things over to the 3 historians joining me in this discussion and have them each introduce themselves and the film they reviewed.
Well, in Chinese, there's a saying, 抛砖引玉, you throw out the brick to attract the jade. So I'll be happy to be the brick in this conversation. I'm Yangyang Cheng. I'm a research scholar in law and fellow at Yale Law School's Paocai China Center, where my research focuses on development of science and technology in China and U.S.-China relations. Though before my current position, I was trained as a particle physicist and worked on the Large Hadron Collider for over a decade. And I should also say that I feel particular affinity to the theme of the film because I was born and raised in China, and both my undergraduate alma mater and my graduate school alma mater here at the University of Chicago played instrumental roles in their country's nuclear and space program. The film I reviewed is Qian Xuesen on Chien, and that was released in 2012. And Qian Xuesen, surnamed Chien, is actually someone who shares a lot of biographical similarities with Oppenheimer. They're about the same age, Chien being several years younger. They both left their home country for graduate school. In Chien's case, to the United States at MIT and Caltech. They both were drawn to left-wing ideas or social activities in their youth, and they both played an instrumental role in building weapons of mass destruction for their birth country, though in Chien's case, he did it for 2 countries, United States at first, and then the People's Republic of China. And both Chien and Oppenheimer lost their security clearances in the 1950s because of alleged communist sympathies and other accusations. And the film, Qian Xuesen lived a remarkably long life to 98 years, and he died in 2009. And the film came out 3 years later and mostly focuses on 2 decades of Qian's career from about 1947 to 1966, starting from when Chien was a tenured young professor at MIT, visiting his birth country of China, then under nationalist rule for the first time since he left. And then he married this young opera singer named Jiang in Shanghai and came back to MIT. And then the film follows Chien as he moved across the country to Caltech to head the new Jet Propulsion Center, and then to the McCarthy era accusations, and where he lost his security clearance, was placed on briefly immigration detention. And he was in this kind of dilemma where he was both barred from leaving the U.S. for having knowledge that is too dangerous, and also assumed to be too disloyal to stay in the U.S. And then in 1955, he was finally allowed to return to his birth country and then led the country's fledgling missile program. And the film culminates in 1966 with the successful detonation of China's first nuclear warhead. That was an atomic bomb attached to a missile that Chien led the design of. And so that is the film. I will not spoil too much of the plot, and we can have more discussions about the themes and the topics later.
My name is David Hecht. I teach in the history department at Bowdoin College up in Maine, so we're at least a little cooler than things in DC at the moment. And I specialize in nuclear history. My first book was actually on Robert Oppenheimer. I wrote about his cultural image after World War II. I'm currently writing on a book on the sort of an environmental history of the nuclear age. So I think the broad outlines of Oppenheimer's life are familiar to many of us, and but so I'll talk about what the movie does with that life, right? It has a kind of roughly chronological sort of like progression that that starts with Oppenheimer as a young man going through sort of pre-war science, which bleeds into his sort of pre-war radical politics, which for him, those social worlds are very connected. Then it moves to Los Alamos. And I think it's important, as I imagine we'll discuss later, say that it's moving to Los Alamos only. We don't really get a glimpse of the whole Manhattan Project here, just the part that Oppenheimer was involved in. We then get some notes about his sort of like late 40s, early 50s sort of scientific policy making and status as a celebrity public intellectual, before moving on to sort of like a much longer section on his 1954 security hearing. Now, I've presented it in a little bit more of a sort of a neat linear way than the movie actually sort of feels like, because it being Christopher Nolan, he does a lot of cross-cutting back and forth between different timelines and ultimately frames the whole thing through Oppenheimer's various struggles with security regimes of various kinds. And so I'll leave it at that, except I'll just sort of say that somewhat has the effect of making the film arguably more about politics than science.
My name is Amit Prasad, and I teach in the School of History and Sociology at Georgia Institute of Technology. And my research focuses on global and post-colonial aspects of science, technology, and medicine. I did a book on the transnational histories of MRI in the US, Britain, and India. And one of the big concerns for me has always been, how do we understand connected histories while emphasizing the role that national and West, non-West, and other boundaries play out. And in light of that, there's a new book of mine which has just come out, which is called Science Studies Meets Colonialism, wherein I look at the interplay of science and colonial to describe the history of the present. Now, the film that I reviewed, Serious Men, it is a Hindi language satirical film based on the fictional novel by the same name that has received many awards. So, unlike the other three films that we are discussing today, this is a fictional film, but it plays very nicely into the concerns that, as we'll see later, that are displayed in these other films, because it also discusses similar issues. Now, specifically, there have been many discussions on the role of race, class, caste, gender, and other social hierarchies in science, particularly in the fields of history and sociology of science and technology. And these exclusions form a very important part of practice of science, but very often, as we saw in Oppenheimer 2, these may not be overtly or even otherwise discussed. The interesting aspect of this film is that it takes us into the intertwined life worlds of science, scientists, and that of caste and class, quite literally to the everyday life, and satirizes the social hierarchies, in particular, how caste is inscribed and also erased in science and society in India. The film, through its portrayal of two science geniuses, one who is a well-established astronomer at a very well-established National Institute of Science, and the other who is the son of the personal assistant of this astronomer. The son here is being projected as a science genius. The astronomer is a Brahmin, that is, he belongs to a so-called upper caste, while the personal assistant and his son are Dalits, a so-called lower caste, and they, in stark contrast to the social and class status of the astronomer, live in a slum. The film highlights the value of science genius in society, like just showing how powerful role they play and how much accepted they are, but also unravels it by focusing on fraud in the actions of both of these. And yet, as the film shows, and I won't go into the particular details of the plot as much, as the film shows, the life trajectories of the two end up very differently. The upper caste Brahmin astronomer is reinstated in his position in spite of his fraud, and the son of the personal assistant loses everything.
And as I said before, I'm Matt Shindell. In addition to being the History of Science Society Secretary, I'm a curator at the National Air and Space Museum, where I curate our collection related to Earth and planetary science. And the movie I reviewed is Goodnight Oppy, which is about the Opportunity rover, which was one of a set of two rovers, Opportunity and Spirit, that were sent to Mars back in 2004. And Opportunity managed to live past its 90-day projected mission time or lifetime and ended up lasting close to 15 years operating on the surface of Mars and explored far more of the surface than it had been expected to when the mission was first planned. And this documentary really focuses on that kind of miracle of technology and also the people who worked with that rover over time, both in developing it and building it, but then also in operating it over that long time frame. And when you have a planetary science mission that lasts that long, you have more than one generation, typically, of scientists and engineers who then get to work on that as some of the senior folks retire or other folks move on to other opportunities with new missions. So, the film is a great glimpse into the sort of the microcosm, that small world of what happens during a planetary science mission at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I would say that it has a few weaknesses in that it does focus so closely on one small set of individuals and doesn't really look beyond the walls of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory to find what the significance is of planetary exploration or how it fits into a longer history of international competition and cooperation in space, and of course the military origins of the technologies that make space exploration possible. But I'll leave it at that so we can get to our discussion. I'm going to throw the first question out there, which is I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about the way that these films present their heroes, whether it's sort of hagiographic in that it focuses on sort of the great man and his great accomplishments, as in the film that Yangyang reviewed, or if it sort of treats them as flawed and tragic individuals, the way that Oppenheimer does. So, what are our thoughts on that? Does anyone want to jump in?
Actually, I was going to follow up on Matt's comment that I should also mention that Qian Xuesen was a founding member of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech when its focus was on rocketry research with the military use before it became a civilian agency with NASA. And so what is as I mentioned earlier, I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Science and Technology of China, and Chien, after he returned to China in 1955, was a founding member of my undergraduate alma mater as well when it was founded in 1958. So I kind of grew up with the legends of Chien, and also growing up in China in the late 90s or early 2000s, there was this idea of science, the highest calling of a science is science and technology in defense of the country or for the state. And so Chien was this kind of heroic figure that was less of a person than a symbol. And so with that understanding, there is this historical or political context. The film Qian Xuesen should be viewed first of all as it's fulfilling a political mission and an educational mission before it's fulfilling an artistic mission. And in that sense, I think one of the hints is from what its film director said during the premiere, that for someone like Qian, we can only 仰视, right? We can only look up to him. And then, of course, that is no way to really make a movie, let alone a movie that is as complicated as Qian. And I think part of the artistic failure of the movie, and I should also emphasize here that I do not want to attribute the film's artistic failure to only the political constraints around it, that is trying to portray Chien as this heroic figure and this idealistic mission of science, that is science and technology in defense of the nation and the state. Because it is a contemporary film made in 2012, and in a way it is also trying to inject some contemporary sensibilities into a bygone era of the Mao era, the revolutionary fervor and the political excesses. In trying to tone down these elements, it is also becoming a somewhat inauthentic or even ambiguous portrayal of someone who is actually embodies a lot of the complexities in terms of allegiance, in terms of their relationship with their birth country and their adopted home, and with the different changes in government.
And David, Oppenheimer is a very different movie in the way that it treats its main central character. Talk a little bit about, some of what you said in your review about this complicated portrayal of Oppenheimer and how it fits in with other efforts to either, make him a symbol of a particular thing or complicate him in different ways.
Yeah, I can answer that, and then I also I have a interesting thought about hagiography with relation to Goodnight Oppy too that hopefully I hope we can get to. But I think the thing about Oppenheimer that is so interesting and is why, like I said in my review, I mean, we have novels about him, we have a bunch of private films, we have documentaries, we have an opera, right? I mean, Nolan is not the first person to attempt this, and I think that one of the sort of interesting things about him as an artistic subject is that he's so ambiguous, right? That you can find almost anything you want in him, right? You can find, he's well read and quotable and eloquent enough that you can find things that make him seem like he has a conscience about, the work they did at Los Alamos, and he deeply regrets that. Or you can point to how he silenced some of his colleagues who had ethical concerns and then jump fairly quickly into war work after Hiroshima, and help build up a nuclear arsenal. And you can make him sort of emblematic of the early arms race, right? And I think that because, there's an interesting moment in the movie after, I don't have the exact quote, where the Edward Teller character is sort of like chatting with Oppenheimer after the war. And he's saying that basically, like, it's essentially like calling him out for his own lack of a center, saying like, who are you? What do you think? Do you even know? And I think a lot of biographers of Oppenheimer would agree that the answer to that is no. Oppenheimer probably didn't have one settled sense of self or character, but that allows someone that just, I think that's what makes him this interesting artistic subject. Is he a hero? Is he a tragic hero? Is he a fallen hero? Is he sort of a villain? You can tell almost any story you want with him.
Yeah, I think I remember in Sam Schwaber's treatment of Oppenheimer, he basically comes out and says that Oppenheimer had no strong sense of self, and that's why he was able to shape himself to fit different moments, different roles, different politics at different times. But ultimately, that shape-shifting gets him in trouble, right?
Exactly. I think I agree with that 100%. So, yeah.
And Amit, the characters in your movie are all very flawed, but have great aspirations and goals. And so how does that sort of speak to, the larger social context or story that this film is trying to present?
So first of all, I would like to situate the idea of hagiography in like science, history of science, as you talked about, to this longer history. So if we look at, and this I mentioned in my review as well, that if we see the hegemony of the West, it is to quite an extent through science. And initially it was expressed more as a dominance, but then it was accepted cutting across different parts of the world. And if you see post-independent, like be it India, or you see in the context of in a different way in China or elsewhere in the world too, and I show this in my book as well. And some historians have argued like this that science becomes a reason of the state, and science is so profoundly like in our system as such through different ways. I found I've been working on for the last 2 years on COVID misinformation, and I so the usual argument is that how they were anti-science. But what I found was the opposite, that it was the credibility of the science was being used to even spread misinformation. I did not find one single misinformation or conspiracy spreader who called himself, herself, or themselves anti-science. So what I see here is the hagiography has to be situated in this much broader historical social discourse that is actually quite unchallenged, including at the time of COVID when it was called that, okay, science is falling apart. And in the film that I reviewed, interesting part is that so one of the senior scientist, the astronomer, he behaves like this science genius and he's portrayed like that. And the younger kid, the son of the assistant, he is wanted to become that science genius. And the moment he's portrayed like that, he's being accepted by like all over by the politicians, he's being quoted by the educational institutions and all. The interesting part, what they do here is they bring in the notion of fraud here. And this is hopefully we get something to discuss even further, that how, like if you look at the moral dilemmas with Oppenheimer also, or the ambiguity that we are talking of, in this case, there is an explicit aspect of fraud, but it unravels in very different way for the upper caste person as opposed to the lower caste, this thing which is there. So what it starts showing us window into that, even when we discuss like the science at the broader level, perhaps we should be aware of, or we should put our eyes or attention to who are being erased or who is not being talked about. Does the hagiography also mean certain erasures and inscriptions? Because erasures are also inscriptions of other things as well. So like in Oppenheimer's case, like we don't get to hear the people who were living in that desert area. It becomes more an expression of a frontier, and of course we hardly get to see those who were impacted directly. So the way I see here is that hagiography has of science has very deep roots in the acceptance of science, to which, let's be very clear, historians of science have played very important role, for example George Sarton being among the most important of those.
Yes, and I wonder if that's sort of part of like inseparable in some ways from, telling a good story, right? Telling a good story requires that you have a hero, whether that's going to be a tragic hero or, a perfect hero or, or whatever type of story you're going to tell. Does that kind of, you know, uh, set up set us up to fall into that trap of reinforcing ideas about the importance of the individual in science as opposed to the importance of the whole scientific community? And Yangyang, it looks like you have something to say.
Sure. So I was going to follow up really quickly on Amit's point, but I'll answer that in relation to your latest question about heroes. And so one thing I wanted to say, like following Amit's point about the relationship between like science, or in particular Western science, and its utilization by the state. And one of the reasons that Chien has played such an important role in how his image was being crafted and being propagandized by the Chinese government is in his relationship with the United States, that his authority and scientific credibility is very much based on his prominence, his education, and his work in the US. On the other hand, because he was so mistreated by the US government, he could also advertise on that part as a way to present the United States as this like evil, right, adversarial regime, and also because of his long life and long career, that he played prominent roles in different stages of how the Chinese state and its primary political ideology and its presentation of science has shifted. So we see how before, in the earlier era, Chien was using his lending his scientific authority for to certain things such as like ludicrous crop production during the Great Leap Forward, and even up to the 1980s, he was still writing articles about how we should use Marxist ideology to guide scientific research, and how modern cosmology is incorrect because it is contrary to Marxist doctrine. But then later, especially in the 90s, this was when really, in the time when I was growing up, when Chien became this kind of really singular figure as this as this role model for scientists of his generation, but also as a role model for the younger generation, was really when Marxist and communist ideology had lost its mass appeal because of Mao era excesses, and then after the bloody crackdown of Tiananmen, and when patriotism became the primary ideological underpinning for the Chinese government to claim its legitimacy, and then Chien became this embodiment of a quote-unquote patriotic scientific hero. And so this is where coming to Matt, your question about heroes, right? And actually, I have a question for David. I guess he'll probably speak next. Is when I watched Oppenheimer, my sense was, I could see that the film director and the production team was really trying to convey a moral ambiguity, but I really didn't necessarily think it is achieving that goal. And one thing that keeps coming to mind was this book that I just read by Christina Sharp, Ordinary Notes, where she wrote about her own experience visiting the Holocaust museums and the Nazi documentation centers in Germany, and which were of course not trying to present any heroic sense. But I will quote here that she said, "We were convinced that depending on where one stood, this memorialization would actually attract people to Nazism, that these objects function as memorabilia. A memorialization not of the wounded, but of the perpetrator. And we saw in them not the condemnation of the Nazis, but their glorification." And that was the sense where I keep feeling these words echo in my mind when I was watching Oppenheimer, was when it was trying to portray the horrors of the film and even the psychological damages inflicting on its creators. It was actually also creating a sense of glorification, even simply by the spectacle, the spectacular effects of the technology itself. And I was wondering whether David has thoughts on that, and any of you. Yeah.
I agree. Thanks. So I'll answer that, and then I had a question for Matt, which I'll sort of put at the end, which is, I agree completely, right? And I mentioned this in my review, but didn't have really space to develop it. Like one directorial choice that is really emblematic of that for me is that Nolan chooses not to show any victims of Hiroshima, right? We do not, so it's almost like the only victims we see are the scientists themselves who are tortured allegedly, right, by what they've done, right? And that is a really different message, right? Than if you actually see the destruction instead of just seeing the scientists seeing the destruction. And I think you're absolutely right that really that contributes to the glorification. Look, these men not only won a war, but they felt bad about it at the same time, right? Without really causing a viewer to reckon with, even if they don't reject. You don't necessarily have to reject what the US did in order to reckon with the cost of it. But the movie, I don't think, forces a viewer to do either of those things. So I agree completely with that. And then just hopefully this isn't too much of a non sequitur, but I did want to ask a question about hagiography to you, Matt, particularly because one of the things that interests me about Goodnight Oppy is the central character as a machine, right? So it's going to have a similar narrative structure in some ways of following the life of a single entity, but you can't invest it with the same kind of hero worship if you can do that at all. And I wonder if that gives it a more natural turn away from hagiography and that it makes you see the collective behind it, or if it's just a different kind of hero worship.
I think it's a sort of a combination of what you're describing. So, on the one hand, it does become the story of this heroic rover, whose story you're presented with in this movie. And by the end, I think you're meant to love that rover as much as the people who worked with it loved it, because you've been presented with its story as they see it, from, being just an idea to being, a thing that you have worked for decades on, sitting on top of an explosive rocket, to making the treacherous journey through space to Mars, surviving landing, and then, exceeding everyone's expectations and roving around for many years. And so, and when they describe the rover and as it ages, they're basically describing it in the terms that we would use to talk about a loved one who is aging and losing some of their capabilities. And they make direct comparisons to, for example, their grandma. One of the engineers talks about their grandmother and the onset of Alzheimer's, to talk about how the Opportunity rover was losing its memory and not as functional anymore, but yet they were finding ways to keep the mission going. But then there is that team aspect, right? That when they mourn the loss of Oppy at the end, and Steve Squires, who was the principal scientist on the mission, makes this point, they're mourning that rover, but they're also mourning that sort of experience of working together and of having that community that they belonged to. They have to turn the lights out on the mission, not just on the rover. So there is that team aspect, but there's still a kind of hagiographic, if you want to put it that way, portrayal of the heroic rover and its, ultimate sacrifice, dying on Mars, never to return to Earth. Even though, the rover has no sentience of its own, we still end up mourning it in the same way or similar to how the scientists and engineers mourn it. Yeah. Amit, I see you have your hand up.
I just want to briefly go back to what David and Yangyang also mentioned with Oppenheimer. One of the things which sort of concerned me, or rather made me think harder, was that not just what is the moral ambiguity, that is, what are the tropes that are used, how it is represented, whether it is true or not, but what does that moral ambiguity do? And I thought in the film, in some ways, very fascinatingly, it resolves the moral dilemmas, or rather, I would say moral responsibilities with regard to Oppenheimer's thing, both with regard to the impact of the bomb, like the way it goes into Truman, or the political, it goes into Strauss, and even in his personal life. So, in a sense, it is a fascinating aspect, and what I wish to just wanted to highlight briefly is that the film goes into a lot of details, and I've seen a lot of discussion on how these dilemmas are very important for us to have rather than seeing in resolute ways. But what they're not discussing often is that whether ambiguity can also become a very effective strategy at both hagiography as well as propelling certain questions to be out. Because very often, when I'm seeing, apart from a few critiques, they are not going into some of these other aspects, so to say. But I wanted to come back to what Matt you talked about, because in the field of science technology studies, where much of my work is, there's this so much celebration of this object-centered ontology, as though the history of the object, including its agency, could talk in ways which is by necessity disruptive of the human-centered discourse. What you showed to us very well in some ways through your review, and you discussed even here, that, well, it is not just that the object could be anthropocentric as something, but the historicization itself can fall into these kinds of same kind of, I would say, pitfalls, lacuna, or excesses. Do you see that, like with Oppy, for example, there was a possibility to r- go beyond, because that is in the sense of go beyond a human-centered uh, kind of. I mean, following on David's question as well here.
Yeah, and I think that it's sort of a pitfall of the way that rover missions and other robotic missions as well, but maybe to a lesser extent, are covered for public consumption. So by journalists, but also by NASA's own public relations office, they tend to talk about what the rover accomplishes as opposed to the people who are working with the rover. And they also, as of not that long ago, have started Twitter accounts in the voice of the spacecraft. So the spacecraft seems to be delivering information directly to the public as opposed to it going through the channels that all of the data does go through. I mean, a great example of that is the way that Opportunity's last words were presented to the public, right? It did not say, what is it? It's getting dark, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's cold and it's getting dark or something like that. That's the way that data was interpreted and then put out to the public. But the rover doesn't speak in first person. The rover doesn't use words like that. It sends back data, and that data is interpreted, and then it's sent to the public. So it's part of how the rovers are presented, and it's a great public relations technique that NASA uses. It's worked really well for them in engaging people in what rovers do and all of that. But it really erases that human dimension of all of the hundreds of people that are involved in that mission and what makes that data accessible. Since I already mentioned that I think in Opportunity or in Goodnight Oppy, they've left out sort of the larger context of the relationship between space exploration and military and national security. Why don't we switch to that topic for a moment? Because all of these films, um, unless they've admitted it, like Goodnight Oppy, address this relationship between science and the state in different ways. What messages are we left with from these films about that relationship, and whether it's a good or bad thing that science has been so involved in building military technologies or bolstering national prestige, or however we want to connect it to the state. What do we think about these films and how they present that? I mean, your film is somewhat different because we see directly this appeal to the state for money in one scene, and the tactics that are used by the eminent astronomer to get the money from the state. Can you speak to that a little bit?
That has been an important concern all the while. I mean, for everybody. Like, how do you get the funding and how do you go about using the funding? So, in the case of this film, the astronomer wanted to prove that there are alien microbes. And so he needed funds for the basically the setup. And because it was not found out, he was really worried that would lead to an ending of the funding. And so he cooks up the data, and that is the fraud for which he is found. So, one, in this film, as well as other places, we see there is an immediate relationship with the state that is there through defense funding or some other kinds of funding as well, in a wide variety of ways. There is also this other element that Gyan Prakash, for example, talked about in his book, Science as the Reason of the State, wherein it becomes imbued in the developmental programs and other things which are there. And I feel one of the things which attracted me to this film was that how science becomes the reason of the society in some ways, wherein what starts happening is that in spite of this criticism, how people actually are celebratory of this and all. So what I am implying here is that sometimes when we critique the science state relationship, we will also have to take into account that how deeply ingrained and embedded it has become at so many levels. And so the state part, how should we fit in this? Should we see it as an aberration, or should we see it as just one other trajectory that is there in this kind of the world that of relationship of science and society state that we are living in?
Oh, Yang, I was just about to ask you, and it seems like you're ready to talk. Is in the Cheng biopic, it's very explicitly about obligation to the state, right? That your protagonist feels a very strong sense of obligation and to the to his own people and to his nation. But even before that, he was working for the state interests of the United States. So, what do you make of that sort of switch that he makes in his career? Obviously, it's, there's a lot of context around it, but yes, please speak to that.
Yeah, so in answer to your question, I think in Chien in real life, we do not know how he really felt about these things. But from all the evidence we saw was that he was very much set on staying in the US and just continuing to work on the type of work he can do in the US, not necessarily out of any particularly ideological sense, but just out of like a technological curiosity. And it was really because of the McCarthy era and his the the mistreatment he felt from the U.S. government, that he essentially felt that he needed to go back to China because his pride was wounded. And I think that the question that lingers was, I don't want to make this kind of comparison to say comparative victimhood, which government he treated him worse, because I think very few governments in the history of the world treated their own people worse than some years in the Mao era. But then when he did go back to China, he didn't have any more options, so he had to conform himself and actually make himself a Chinese Communist Party member when he was a victim of communist accusations in the U.S. that derailed his career. And so in this sense, this is Chien in real life, and the film and what makes this film and any kind of biography of Chien so difficult in the Chinese political context is this truth cannot be fully told because he is a man that embodies so many contradictions. So there needs to be certain ambiguities or certain omissions or flat out fabrications to present this version of Chien as a consistent patriotic hero, even though for someone of Chien's age, he was born in the final year of the Qing Empire. He lived and worked and went to the U.S. on a Boxer Indemnity Scholarship as a citizen of the Republic of China, and then came back and then contributed to the People's Republic, where the ruling state of China changed, its borders shifted, and a lot of things changed. So what is actually China in Chien's sense is an open question as well. But then coming to the relationship between science and state, there are actually certain analogies I might draw between the Qian Xuesen biopic, the film, and Oppenheimer, the film. Right? There are this idea of this. There is an alien threat, whether it's the Nazis trying to build a bomb, or in the Chinese sense, it becomes easier because it was like, oh, because the United States already has it and already used it, and also there is this interesting scene, which is almost similar, but artistically very, very different. In the sense where there is a colleague in the Oppenheimer film is Ai Rabi, and then in Chang Jason film is this character inspired by the Chinese nuclear and space scientist Guo Yonghuai, who expressed moral objections to it. And in the Oppenheimer film, of course, it is very understandable why it was included. I was actually somewhat surprised I was included in the Qian Xuesen film at all. That why this note of moral, very fleeting note of moral objection needs to be included, whether it was a certain an expression of conscience on the production team, or it was trying to redeem the innocence of the Chinese nation state. That is still it is not this kind of trying to contrast itself with the United States. And I would end on the note that I hope we would have a bit of time to discuss is the relationship between science and state in both the Oppenheimer film and the Chien film, and is embodied in a very, very gendered way, that the science and technology is being used to facilitate this patriarchal ideology, and the sense of what is safety, what is security, what is protection is being interpreted through this very patriarchal lens.
Yeah, that's actually the next topic I wanted to get to was gender and how it's presented in these films in terms of both the gendering of science, but then also the ways that gender is depicted in the relationships that the individual scientists or protagonists have. So, David, if you can speak to that first. I mean, there's some really interesting stuff going on with Oppenheimer and his relationships with women, but then there's also the sort of larger sense of the Los Alamos campus being a very male-dominated facility, and also physics itself being a very male-dominated field.
Right. Which it's really, so the portrayal of Jean Tatlock, his mistress and ex-fiancée, and is really, problematic doesn't seem to quite capture it, but I'm searching for another word. Her function in the narrative is basically, as this kind of as the communist woman who tempts Oppenheimer away from the bomb, away from his duties and gets him into trouble, right? And certainly I don't think of all the people who have appropriate Oppenheimer's story, Nolan's not the only one to do this. That's how the story is usually told, but there is certainly I mean, I guess, on my second time watching it, I saw a little bit more sort of like nuance in Kitty's role in this, right? Even though it fits stereotypes in a lot of ways as well. So yeah, so I don't think the film deals with gender in a particularly interesting way. I mean, there is that sort of like, somewhat heavy-handed moment where there's the female scientist Lily, I forget the last name, who says like they try to like take her away from potentially dangerous work because it'll affect your reproductive systems, and then she, has the joke back about, well, why mine and not yours, right? But it's, but so I think that is maybe Nolan's attempt to sort of like at least signal the masculinity of that world, but I don't think it is really, I mean, it's barely acknowledged and certainly not addressed in any kind of in depth in any way. So those are my initial thoughts there. Yeah.
And Amit, in your film, it seems like, this is also reflected somewhat in the caste system in terms of that different forms of masculinity are expected at different levels. And at the Brahmanic level, as you point out, sacrifice is part of that sort of masculine scientific characterization. Can you speak more about that?
Yeah. So to follow up, as David said here, like, and to build on it, that and to what Yangyang also asked, that we also have to see that in the very depiction of science or practice of science as a boys' club, is it and the masculine play of it, even though it may not directly deal with gender, but the patriarchal exclusion is built into it. So there is an explicit case which is there, but at the same time, this blindness, and this is where we have to be careful that these erasures are themselves reflective of consolidation of the patriarchal masculine. In the film that I reviewed, like The Serious Men, so the female characters, one is the wife of personal assistant to the astronomer, and she is always portrayed as somebody who does not know much, who is not understanding even why it is important for the son to succeed in a certain way. So there is a role which is at best a mediator or facilitator. In fact, this was best displayed in Chen's, like the film on Chen, for example, that the wife like eventually talks off in the end that, okay, I'm contributing you to the world. In this case, so one is that character. The other is a fellow scientist with the astronomer, whose name is Oparna. And the film briefly alludes to that they were having an affair, and basically she helps him to fudge the data. So what you start seeing here is making the female an accomplice without providing even a place of having a full character in a certain way. So the gender is, so to say, so much on display through its absence, like as such, which is like we see here, and the reinforcement of like the genius, for example, this arrogant genius that the astronomer plays out. And in many ways we see in Oppenheimer, and we see in Chen too, very much like, even though it may not be expressed in Chen's case as abrasive way, maybe in linguistic terms, but at the same time, the masculine play of genius is so much at play. And in the film that I reviewed, the young kid, 10-year-old, he tries to follow that. He would start saying, like, if he wanted to respond, he'll say, I don't want to respond to primitive minds or things like that. So there is this, it's a very fascinating thing, particularly in these three films, even with the Oppy one to an extent, but it is very striking how gendered, patriarchal, masculine the whole display is.
Yeah, I'd say that even in Goodnight Oppy, there are some moments that express a certain form of scientific masculinity, even though the people who were interviewed, it's a very good mix of men and women and people from around the world and different backgrounds, which speaks actually to good work that NASA has done to, find gender parity and diversity over the years in some very successful programs that they've run. But there are those moments where, for example, Steve Squires, who I mentioned before, is the principal scientist on the mission, talks about himself and the rover mission in the terms of, that kind of heroic 18th, 19th century explorer who's willing to sacrifice for their science and doesn't want to work on stuff that's been worked on before. They want to find new peaks. They want to discover new places. And for Squires, he feels like he has to go to Mars in order to discover a new place. And he wants to be that type of explorer. Yangyang, you have your hand up. I think you want to continue the discussion.
Yeah, so actually, I do have a question for you, Matt, on along these lines. But I'll first comment quickly about the gender dimensions in the Chien film. Actually, I was going to say really quickly to David that I felt the Jean Tatlock character was just like very much the embodiment of like a siren.
Totally.
It was so wild, and also the and what is interesting was how one might contrast that with how the primary woman in the Chang Jason film is embodied, because as this good woman, Jiang Ying, who actually had a very modern in a way she was a very modern woman because she grew up very privileged. She lived and studied in Europe and studied Western opera for a decade before returning to China, and so the film opens with her giving a performance as this young hot opera singer in Shanghai, and then ends with this particular scene that I want to mention is how she talked about she has no regrets in her life because she married even though she sacrificed her career for chance, and then she gave this quote which by all accounts is a fabrication attributed to Winston Churchill's mother, who allegedly said on her deathbed that I have no regrets in life because I gave birth to Winston Churchill for Great Britain. And now when I this line actually didn't come from the film itself. It's actually quite popular line in China attributed to Winston Churchill's mother, which is fascinating because if only people knew who Winston Churchill's mother was, as this socialite who had 3 husbands and many lovers and didn't really raise Winston Churchill, isn't really this embodiment of a conventional good mother or good woman that the Chinese state or society wants to promote. However, what is important here, which is really fascinating, is who Winston Churchill's mother was not important at all, as in who Jiang Ying was or what her aspirations were important were not important at all, because important part is the most important man in their lives, and their characters and their image can be molded in a way as in just for the creation or the facilitation of this masculine hero figure. And then so what comes to the question I have for Matt is what is interesting is like, well, David also mentioned this, right? Like we know that in the Manhattan Project, scientists they decide that if the bomb is a dud, it will be named a girl, and so if it's a boy, then it means it's a working bomb. And I do not know enough about the history of rover or different space probe missions in the US to know, but I was very disturbed by the way how an opportunity and spirit were always referred to as female, and also I note this particular choice in the film was their voice is embodied by Angela Bassett, this iconic Black woman with a distinct voice, and I feel the robots were not only anthropomorphized, but they were also particularly gendered and in a way ethnicized or racialized. And I was curious, Matt, what are your thoughts on that, especially when that distinct Black woman is a distinct Black woman's voice is being placed into a scene, as you mentioned, right? Even though the film made a specific effort to find diverse voices, whenever it pans to the whole laboratory, it's still a very white male-dominated environment.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. It is still a very white male-dominated environment, and to add to that, this idea that Angela Bassett is the voice of opportunity. The very first U.S. rover Sojourner, which arrived at Mars in 1997, was named Sojourner after Sojourner Truth, right? The African American abolitionist and advocate of women's rights. And it was named through a naming contest that NASA ran, where middle school students were asked to provide names and reasons why the rovers should be named after their favorite heroines. So they were specifically asked for, for women's names. And so the flight spare that we have on display at the Air and Space Museum is named Marie Curie because Marie Curie was the other name that was selected in this contest. And I think that connects to a longer history in the US and possibly Europe as well of naming technologies and considering them female. And I don't know why that is, why craft have been traditionally named after women, but that has carried forward into the naming of spacecraft. Although, NASA has tended not to name that many spacecraft after individuals. Instead, with the other rovers, they've been named Spirit, Opportunity, Curiosity, Perseverance, these sort of ideals as opposed to people's names. But the new ESA rover, Rosalind Franklin, that should go to Mars in the coming years, is going to be the next example of a rover named after a woman. So, there is that interesting tradition that seems to be kind of at odds with the male domination of the science, or maybe it speaks to the male domination of the science and this desire to control a technology and name it after a woman. So, I don't think it's received a good deal of analysis. Amit?
So, just to add to like what you people are talking here, I also felt that, I mean, for example, the way like females are used here, as has been already pointed out, either to facilitate the careers of the people or as mediators which allow either absolution, like in the, so even when the discussion is with regard to the female reproductive organ, it almost seemed to me that, okay, we are aware of the gender issue. So the film is sort of trying to play into that. That's it. In fact, interestingly, with Tatlock's character, one of the interesting, fascinating part I found, which has caused a lot of controversy, particularly in India, wherein she asks him to read the slok or the verse from Gita while having sex. I thought it actually, in a playful way, it satirizes the way, for example, Oppenheimer used to go about like showing off as genius. It's quite evident that he did not know Gita well because there's the reference to Vishnu rather than Krishna. So I think by doing it that, making it banal and playful, I thought Tatlock character is sort of disrupted that, because it's well known that Oppenheimer would always try to show this. There are these like so many writings after writing that how actually like, oh, Hindus were better in this, or the fact that Gita has got it or something. So I thought Tatlock's character at one level was a way to sort of, I wouldn't say absolve him for his personal commitment as well as the political transgression, but another way it was playful in terms of make fun of him. I thought that that particular act sort of made fun of the way he used to display his genius. I just wanted to say that here.
And David?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I have to mull that over. I was going to throw in a different. I mean, I agree that like everything that we're saying about gender in these films and depictions of women. I mean, in Oppenheimer, you basically have like, on one hand, this communist temptress, on the other hand, like the alcoholic wife who can't take care of her kids, right? I mean, it's just right. They're basically, women only show up in Oppenheimer's life as like problems or disruptions in some way, right? But the one moment that changes that a little bit is that Kitty Oppenheimer, when she's called to testify in the hearing, right? She is about the only person who testifies in his behalf. And this is actually somewhat true in the real life hearing as well, who sort of sees the game for what it is and calls out Roger Robb and the board for like, I mean, the grammar they're using and the shape of the questions. And she essentially is the only one who doesn't accept the terms that Strauss has laid out, right? Sort of saying like, I can't tell you, I don't have the exact quote. Like, she's like, I can't tell you, when he stopped being a communist because I challenge your presumption that he ever was one. Right. And so that, it's an interesting moment and sort of like the only moment where you see her having, I think, any real agency or frankly ability to like suss out a situation better than he can. So,
well, we have time for a couple of closing thoughts, and I see that Amit and Yangyang both are raising their hands. So, Yangyang?
Sure. I'll just say quickly as a follow-up to the gene catalog sex thing. And actually what I found interesting was that thing, the way I interpret it is if the bomb or the missile becomes the embodiment of masculine power, then in a way, in that sex scene, it is also making land as gendered as female, and so there is this metaphoric sense in it. And so this probably is a good segue to a closing thought, is that I felt we didn't have a chance to discuss the ideas of not just gendered boundaries, but ethnic and racial boundaries, and the idea of colonialism and imperialism in these projects, and of course an analogy between the Qian Xuesen's work and the film itself, and also Oppenheimer, is, for example, the primary nuclear test site in China is Lop Nor, which is part of the traditional Uyghur homeland. And as David mentioned earlier, right, the Oppenheimer film didn't show the bombing victims in Japan, but it also did not really show the victims of nuclear tests in the United States, or how these or the idea of the context of native dispossession that is that is behind these work. And so I think this is in a way also reflected in the ideas of space exploration as this kind of pristine virgin space territory that can be open for continued masculine conquest. And so that is the note I want to end on here.
I don't think I could have said it better. Yeah, I totally agree. There is this, continuation of coloniality and the way we speak about space and colonizing it and settling it that really connects, not just metaphorically, but in very real historical ways, to that history of colonialism and Western expansion. So, thank you for articulating that. And then Amit, you have the last word.
Well, I think it's been very well put, and I'm glad that we are also ending on this because, with regard to coloniality, you talk of this that one of the ways, for example, the European colonialism has been projected as an exploration. And what it does is that it hides so much of the history as such. Like in the like your review, you talk about that how the exploration of Mars was like similar to, as you explained, exploration of the Earth. But that exploration of the Earth was a colonial project, and it was not just by itself. And so I think it is important. I really think it is important for us, maybe just to highlight this, that how this relationship of the science colonial, including with gender and other things, they play out into the present day in a wide variety of ways, including in the way science is celebrated and accepted across the world. And I think it'll be important for us to see the coloniality at so many different levels. And I'm really glad that we were able to bring it out on so many different ways. On a lighter note, if I can just take 1 second here, I felt that Kitty's actually character, when she was speaking in that eloquent way, given that kind of a power, so to say, it allowed basically sort of absolving, very eloquently absolving Oppenheimer from his communist responsibilities, saying that. So one sentence was like striking, that how he was trying to. The reason why he donated the money was this was the way to reach out the poor. So it was very interesting again here that given an eloquent place, a eloquent characteristic, that also is with just that same role of sort of serving the purpose for Oppenheimer. That's it.
Great. Well, thank you, Yangyang, David, Amit, for joining this discussion. And thank you, Babak, for being the man behind the glass, producing the episode. And we have to end with a quick quiz question, as is tradition for these podcast episodes. So I'm going to throw out the question that should be easy for anyone who's seen the Oppenheimer movie or maybe even hasn't. What is the possibly deadly prank that Oppenheimer attempts to pull at the Cavendish Laboratory?